In this session, we continue with our theme, A Certain Word for Uncertain Times. And we're looking at the book of Philippians. And in this session, we will look at verses 12 through 18 of Philippians chapter 1. Now, in the previous verses, Paul has expressed his confidence that the good work that God began in the church will continue until the day of Christ. He said from the first day until now and on into the day of Christ, the day of his return. He's going to take care of you. So he's given his confidence in that. And of course, the church would have been concerned for their well-being, given the difficulties, the tribulation, the persecution that they were experiencing at this time. But their concern also would have been for the gospel advancing. You could see this. For they understood that Paul was leading the charge in this missionary effort of the first century. And now he's in prison. So does this mean the end of that? Is this going to hinder the gospel going forward or not? And then also, of course, they had a concern for him, and we'll see that later in the next section after this. But in any event, Paul wants them to be confident that the gospel, in spite of how it looks, the gospel is advancing. And so I want us to look at verses 12 through 18. I want to read them to us now from Philippians chapter 1. And let's look at why it is that Paul is confident that even though he's in chains, that the gospel will continue to advance. He says, verse 12, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice." So I think you have to really appreciate the heart of Paul here in this section as we see him rejoicing, regardless of the intent or the attitudes of those who are preaching, some of them, that he still rejoices that either way the gospel is being preached. But he begins by saying that the first reason why the gospel is advancing in spite of his incarceration is because of the whole palace guard. In fact, he said, and all the rest are aware of the fact, they know that his chains are in Christ. So they know, in other words, that it's because of the gospel, because of Paul preaching Christ, that he's there in prison in Rome, most likely. They know that. And so they are, this whole group that he's basically indicating would not have otherwise heard the gospel. That's my new congregation, my audience, as it were. These are the ones who are hearing the gospel that most likely would not have otherwise. So he's saying that that's a good thing. So the gospel is advancing because it's going to an area that I wasn't planning on, and it's not like I've stopped being able to proclaim at all. Now, the second reason why he says that the gospel is advancing is because that there are those who become emboldened to proclaim. They've gotten some confidence to preach the gospel of Christ because of the fact that Paul has been placed in prison. Now, some of these would, he said, they do it out of love, they out of goodwill, and they know that I've been appointed, and the word there is to set. They know I've been set. I've been given that position, that place of defending the gospel, proclaiming the gospel. And they know that. And so they're taking up the slack. They're saying, well, that Paul is willing to be in prison for this, then obviously it's important, and we can take up that place. And so there's this desire to take up what's lacking. So Paul's now in this new venue of prison, and they're going to be going to other places and in their own ministry to proclaim the gospel. So that's a good thing. And that makes Paul happy, obviously. Now, the other thing is, there are those who are doing it out of envy and jealousy. and thinking they're going to add affliction, Paul says, to his chains. So I think also that they're kind of attributing to him their own attitudes. They were jealous or envious of Paul and his ministry. So now he's out of the way. And so they're attributing that jealousy. Paul might be jealous of them doing that. So he might burn a little bit there in prison because they're taking his place, as it were. And Paul says, it really doesn't matter to me whether the gospel is being preached in pretense or in truth. It's being preached, and I'm rejoicing in that. So Paul was determined to have joy, and his joy here is, I think, central to his heart and to his life, and that is that Christ is being preached, and that's what he's really after here. Personal loss for him, but he's saying the gospel is being proclaimed, and I'm rejoicing in that, regardless of the intents or purposes of those who are proclaiming. I think it's a good lesson for us to also, as we look around, and there are those who might be proclaiming the gospel, and there's certain maybe they're too negative for our view, or too positive, or whatever, or they're emphasizing something we wouldn't emphasize or don't emphasize. But there has to be room for us to rejoice with the preaching of the gospel. Not too long ago, I heard a preacher on television, and he has a particular emphasis that I'm not fond of, and I thought, you know what, I'm not sure I want to really listen to this guy. What good's he doing, And then he gave an altar call. He gave an opportunity for people to come forward and receive Christ. Now, I'm 72 years old. I've been in the church all my life, and I have never heard a better invitation to come forward and receive Christ than the one that he gave that night. And I'm going, oh, okay, well, maybe we might need him after all. So let's be generous. Let's be loving in our views of others, and rejoice like Paul that the gospel is being preached. God bless you.